Well, good morning. My name is Jurrian Arnold, and I'm very pleased to be here for the second time. I was here 6 years before, teaching on a summer school in Bolderaya. I made some pictures. I want to start with asking some questions that I ask as an urban designer. Who feels responsible for this place? And why do people care? How can people change and adapt their living environment? What possibilities do people have to renew their homes and make them sustainable for the future? Well, these are questions that are equally relevant in the Dutch context as well as in the Latvian context. But they might get a different answer. Whereas the majority of social housing in Holland is owned by housing corporations who take responsibility and care for them. And I understand that the majority of housing in Latvia has been privatized after its independence. So when there's a need for renewal of old Soviet houses, this poses the challenge how owners are enabled to renew them and adapt them to future needs. In other words, how are they empowered to take responsibility in renewing the living environment? Let me briefly introduce myself. I'm from the Netherlands, and I grew up in a time of large urban expansion where everything was planned by urban designers and every house was designed by architects. Then I started studying in Belgium, and planning was different there. There was an absence of planning in one sense. People built their own homes, and this might not give the best aesthetic result. I started to respect how people created their own living environment and started to renew it step by step, or one house after the other. Then I started studying urbanism in Delft and I started working in Rotterdam in urban regeneration. Recently I started my own practice together with 3 partners. Open Kaart, co-creating the living environment. And open Kaart means an open plan and figuratively being honest and straightforward about your objectives. And we create design solutions for people and together with people who want to invest in their own living environment, and we enable them to do so. So about empowerment, I want to share some different approaches about empowerment and the role of the designer in that, and share also some experiences I had in Rotterdam. But let me start about what empowerment is. When you Google it, you will get all kinds of management illustration. Helping each other step up, achieving great heights, or removing your shackles from oppression and standing strong together. But empowerment originates from actually big political struggles, like the vote to right for women, the right to vote for women. Or closer to home, I think is a really inspiring example, the Baltic Way. 2 million people standing in a chain of 600 kilometers to show their desire to be independent of the Soviet Union. And it's about that, if you look at the definition, giving authority or power to someone to do something. So, what is empowerment in urban development? Well, I would say it might be started with political struggle, but it's also about really ordinary things. How people can control their living environment and take responsibility in its renewal. I show you 3 different approaches from the context of the Netherlands, starting where it began in the Netherlands, in the neighbourhood of the Oude Weste, in the center of Rotterdam. Cramped houses in poor condition were about to be removed by a new plan of planners with modernist housing. This was common practice at that moment in Holland. Urban designers were almost scientists here on national television explaining about the expansion of the city of Amsterdam. The urban designer Cornelis van Eesteren wearing a lab coat, and his associate Jacoba Mulder later apologizing for not wearing appropriate clothing. But this started to change. People didn't longer accept that they neglected their desires or their needs in urban development. For instance, to keep existing communities intact. They started protests over the whole country, starting in the Oude Westen, and the new credo became building for the neighbourhood. And one of the main political proponents, Jan Schever, he later became Minister of Housing, says here on a campaign poster, building for the neighbourhood is building for yourself. Decisions about planning were not longer made at the planning department, but in action committees, composed out of active residents. They could decide what was to be demolished, what would be renovated, what types of buildings would be built anew. They even could select architects. And architects or designers and planners really quickly had to adapt to these circumstances, finding new ways of communicating in this often chaotic meetings with a lot of emotions. And for the Oude Westen, this was very successful. Actually, they demolished more houses than they planned in the previous plan. But what came back was a more low-scale neighborhood with a lot of pedestrianized area, and it's still active today, and really diverse, more than 70 nationalities. But participation, as it became known, was not always successful, as Shelley Arnstein pointed out in '69. It was often also misused because of the kind of opposing forces, government institutions, and citizens on the other side. And to mock this, here, I participate, you participate, we all participate, and they profit. To clarify this practice of participation, she introduced the ladder of participation, showing on the top side citizens in control, and on the downside manipulation or kind of tokenism from government institutions to involve people but not really listen to them. And so as an alternative for this kind of two opposing forces, and one has to empower the other to be involved in urban planning, there was a thinker and a Dutch architect, and later to become dean in MIT, John Habrake, who said, well, there should be no participation without responsibility. Or in other words, people should have get far more responsibility in their immediate living environment. And in his book, Support and the People, Alternatives for Mass Housing, he studied traditional houses and showed that a lot of elements of traditional housing were constantly changing and adapted and built new, and other parts were lasting for sometimes more than 200 years or hundreds of years. And as an alternative for mass housing, he pleaded for a clear distinction between supports that would last like hundreds of years and the infill that people could control themselves, that they could own themselves. Together with a large group of architects and planners, they put this into practice in several neighborhoods in Holland. They were created with a method called open building, creating supports which could be freely divided and merged and splitted again over time, with an infill structure. And also the urban design plan followed the same concept, having a structure and having freedom to make diversity in detail. So this was also kind of alternative for a planning system, to relate the responsibility of citizens towards the scale of the urban fabric. So as an owner of your house, you can control your house. As a group of inhabitants of a block, you can control what's happening to your block, and so on, about the neighborhood and about the larger scale. Well, you could say this is more of a framework in which people can take control themselves. Well, another approach where people take control themselves in urban development, I would call more as the actor network approach, where active citizens take initiative and form coalition within a network with other government organizations, also businesses and social organizations. An example here in Rotterdam, a group of citizens wanted a ferry to connect Charloes with Katendrecht, to be closer to important amenities, and well, they started all kinds of projects to get this message on the footlight, and also collected funding, created manifestations, and also the government or the municipality helped eventually to get this done, and now the ferry is going up and down. And you see this phenomena more and more. For instance, the architect's office of Gert Oeraan, they published a book with all kinds of examples where actually not the government starts taking initiative in urban planning, but the initiative is coming from organized residents, citizens, and businesses together. Well, in a simplified way, to put the three approaches together next to each other, you can see a different role for the for the designer in general. Like the first about participation in the Oude Westen, you see two opposing forces: the government institutions and citizens that have to be empowered. The designer will be in between, representing the empowered group. The second, the framework in which people can take responsibility themselves. The designer is concerned with designing a framework that kind of gives this control on a lower scale, or even activates this kind of sense of responsibility to take care of the lower scale. And the third, it's about the designer will be part of coalitions and maybe even take initiative himself, and in coalition also kind of questioning the framework or altering the framework itself. You could adapt zoning plans, create new infrastructures, etc. And I want to share an experience regarding to the last model in a place in Oud-Charloes, a neighborhood of Rotterdam, called the Gouwplein. A small public space on a junction of 5 streets, where back then people rather circled around than to cross it because of drugs abuse and violence, harassment. They even put a ban on assembly on this place, so you could not gather there with more than 3 people to control these problems. Well, a group of residents were fed up with that, and they voiced their anger by means of a mobile bus stop. Well, the bus stops were the only places where they could gather legally. So they put this on the square to say, like, so we can make use of it. And at that point, the municipality didn't say, like, didn't kind of completely redesign the square in one go. They first asked, like, how can we help? How can we support you redesigning this place or making a new concept for this place. And they asked me, I was working back then for a research organization called Veldacademie. They asked me to lead this process. And we started with a group of residents and the local municipality at one table, and the decisions were made there. Also the budget for renovating this place, we could decide about on that table with everybody who was sitting at the table. And we started an open process. So every step that we made, we communicated again, and we invited other people to participate in this process, coming with new ideas. And this created a kind of snowball effect. So new people joined in. Also funding came from different organizations. Responsibilities were taken up, for instance, with cleaning the space in the future, etc. At some point, a designer from the municipality, from the planning department, made a coherent plan with all of these ideas, and still being open for contributions that were made by involved residents. For instance, a group of mothers selecting the playground facilities, or the street lighting. They were designed by an artist. They were already made, but they had to be replaced from one place to this place. Or the street furniture was made by a carpenter from the neighborhood. And the result was a completely different use of this place. Children play there, people gather, there are activities organized up to a point that the ban of assembly could be lifted because the problems were no longer there. And the square could get its formal name. It didn't have a name yet, and now it's called the Gouwplein. So, I would define empowerment in urban development as follows. The distribution of control to enable citizens to take initiative, influence their living environment, and take responsibility in its renewal. And you might ask the question, like, why go through all the effort? Because it costs a lot of time and also money to do this. But the city is too complex to be managed centrally. At some point, you need people to take responsibility in its renewal on a lower scale, on their houses, on their living environments. From an environmental psychological perspective, control over your living environment is an essential factor for feeling good in your environment, for the perception of livability. It also increases social capital, and people getting to know each other. They're sharing information. It also builds trust between citizen organizations and municipal organizations. And you use collective creativity, which create a lot of surprising ideas, and there's culture development. So in this fits changing needs of this time. People have more free time and more knowledge. They are higher educated and therefore also have more need for independence and autonomy in this matter. So back to Riga, to think what this could mean, I have some examples. For instance, if you ask the question, what could you change on one scale level in order for people to take initiative on a lower scale level? Recently in Barcelona, they came up with a plan to create super blocks of 9 smaller blocks. And by doing so, rerouting the traffic, they specifically do that in order for residents and small businesses to reprogram and reuse the inner spaces. Or what kind of initiative, what kind of aspirations do people have to renew these houses? And what kind of knowledge would facilitate them? How can they know what you can actually do with it to make them sustainable for the next 30 years? Well, in my municipality, there's a place for people that want to do that, to get knowledge, to ask these questions. For instance, about how the best way for your type of housing to make it more energy efficient. So to conclude, I would say empowerment should not have to be a big political struggle, but it should actually become a practice, because eventually everybody cares for their living environment, and within the right conditions, if they're enabled, this will show. Maybe not in a spectacular way, but in a really ordinary way. For taking care of your own house, painting the front, to a little play garden on a green spot in between some buildings. Thank you.